Hello and welcome to the review and recap series for the Elizabethans. The purpose of these videos is to provide you with an overview of each of the key components on the Elizabethan paper. There is going to be 6 videos in total. The first 5 will look at each key component in detail, and the last video will focus on exam technique and look at how to answer each of the question strands. In this video we'll be looking at Elizabeth and her government. So let's start with Elizabeth's background. So Elizabeth is the second daughter of Henry VIII. Her mother was a lady called Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is Henry's second wife. He sought an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. This is really important though, as Catholics might not acknowledge Elizabeth as a legitimate child because they would not recognise the fact that Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII were married. So sometimes she's referred to as illegitimate and therefore could be considered as not the rightful Queen of England because of her birth and the situation of her parents. She has a younger brother, Edward VI, and she has an older sister, Mary I. Elizabeth takes the throne last, her brother first because he is male, and then her older sister, and then finally Elizabeth. Religion. Religion had changed a lot in England. So Henry VIII was initially a Roman Catholic. However, in 1534 he establishes the Church of England, and therefore the country becomes Protestant. Henry himself doesn't make many changes to the church. It's actually under his son Edward VI that we see Protestantism really enforced and the changes to the church. Edward himself persecutes Catholics as heretics. However, when Mary takes over, she is a devout Catholic and she reverts the official religion back to Roman Catholic and therefore now persecutes Protestants as heretics. Elizabeth then, she's referred to as a moderate Protestant, and that is a term that you need to be using. Moderate meaning a little bit more lenient than, say, her brother Edward, but she is Protestant and not Catholic. We'll be looking at this term in more detail when we look at the issue of Catholicism. What about her path to power then? So Elizabeth, from a very young age, is educated to the highest standards. She's a very gifted public speaker, and this serves her well when she is queen, and enables her to gain quite a lot of support on the battlefield with the Privy Council and within the royal court itself. She's largely supported as the heir to Mary I, and there's little opposition in her earlier years. She is the final Tudor monarch, which means she doesn't have any children, and the issue of succession will be a problem throughout her reign. She becomes queen on the 17th of November in 1558. So when Elizabeth becomes queen, there's a belief at the time called the Great Chain of Being, and this is to do with how society is ordered. So we've got the nobility at the top, so these are your lords and you're born into that position, so it's a birthright. Then we've got our gentry classes, which is the largest group. It's your middling source, so it could be people who are the landed gentry, so countryside landlords. It could be your merchants and traders within the towns and cities. We've then got yeoman farmers, and then lastly labourers. The majority of the population are labourers, so they do a physical job for a living. That's probably going to mainly include agricultural work, but it also includes things like servants in households. So the population is rapidly increasing in the Elizabethan period, which means there's going to be more competition for work, increased rent and food prices. Therefore, more people are going to have to travel around in search of work. Because the roads have improved as well, this enables travel to happen, but it also means communication can become more effective because it can spread quicker around the country. There's also lots of famine and poor harvest, which means the labourers are going to be worse affected because they're going to be the ones that financially suffer because they have the least amount of money, and that's where most of their work stems from. When Elizabeth inherits the throne, it's in a very bad situation. There's been lots of inflation of the money. There's lots of poverty caused as a result. She's therefore under pressure to increase taxation, to raise funds, but she's also got to be mindful that this could lead to rebellion. So let's look at how she actually established control in her country. So let's start with the royal court. So who are the royal courts? I'm saying who are the royal court because it's not a physical place, but a select group of people. This will be people from all walks of life because you'll have servants and people from the labouring background, but also people up to the nobility. So this includes the Privy Council, which I'll talk about more on the next slide, but also the Privy Chamber, which is made up of her ladies-in-waiting and people that would accompany her in her private chambers. It is mobile, which means it follows the Queen throughout England. Because we've talked about the fact that there's going to be many nobles and gentry men here, this is a place with lots of power and influence. So what happens in the royal court? Lots of different things. So some important trials, it hosts foreign diplomats, banquets, dancing, and because Elizabeth herself loves theatre, companies of actors like Lord Chamberlain's men would actually visit and put on private performances for her. So the royal court itself acts as propaganda to glorifying the Queen, so it's really important that she's presented in the best light in all times. There's also going to be lots of patronage in the royal court, so this is creating factional rivalries between the gentry families, and this will then ensure loyalty to the Queen. So in the summer, the Queen and her court would actually go on royal progresses to try and avoid the disease and the heat of the cities. So they would go and stay with nobles and allow people to physically see her, and this will help to boost the impression of royal power as well. Privy Council. So the Privy Council are selected male political advisors who are often courtiers as well. They always are going to be male because it's a patriarchal society, which means it's male dominated. So they're going to advise on a number of issues, from taxation to gentry disputes and issues on patronage and who to award certain titles to. They meet at court almost daily. So key members then you need to be aware of. So William Cecil holds the position of Secretary of State from 1558 to 1572 and then again from 1590 to 1598 upon his death. He is a moderate Protestant like Elizabeth. However, he's more willing to suppress Catholics than Elizabeth herself. He focuses on trying to avoid foreign and religious disputes and manages to do that fairly successfully. He challenges Elizabeth, but he is very, very loyal. He's often referred to as one of her closest advisors throughout her time as Queen. So Francis Walsingham then, he's also Secretary of State from 1572 to 1590. He's a strong Puritan. So this is an example of how Elizabeth surrounds herself with people of different beliefs intentionally, and this allows him to actually want to persecute Catholics more so than Elizabeth. He's often called the spy master, and he's referred to having the eyes and ears all across the country. Francis Walsingham is responsible for uncovering lots of plots against Elizabeth and keeping her safe during her reign, and we'll talk more about this when we look at several oppositions against her. Sometimes it could be distant, did argue with Elizabeth once or twice, but overall remains loyal, and you can see served her through a long period. Then we've got Robert Dudley. So she's known him from a very young age. They often are referred to having a close friendship. Some people even believe that they had a series of affairs. In 1585, he commanded the army in the Netherlands as well. He's another favourite of Elizabeth. So the Privy Council itself is made of about 19 members, but on a daily basis, only about 7 or 8 will be present at each meeting. Elizabeth is very clever with who she appoints. She deliberately chooses men who have different viewpoints. So like we've already looked at, Walsingham's a strong Puritan. She might have men who favoured a little bit more Catholic beliefs. This is important because she then knows these men won't conspire against her. And she's going to get a range of advice, but she doesn't have to worry about them ganging up on her and enforcing her to follow certain advice. She also offers patronage to her councillors in return for loyalty. They want to win the favour of the Queen because it's going to mean more influence, more power and more money for themselves. Right, let's look at Parliament. Just to be clear though, Parliament is not a democratic institution like it is today. It's very different. So the role of Parliament then, there are still 2 houses like we know today. House of Commons, which is made up of gentry. They are not elected, however. And then we've got the House of Lords, which is made up of nobles and bishops. So people who, the way I tend to remind it, is people who are actually generally lords. They meet only 13 times in 45 years. She will need to speak to them if she wants to raise taxes or change laws. She has to meet with Parliament. That is a requirement. Ultimately, though, she can optionally take their suggestions. She needs them for important decisions, but she does not have to listen to them. She does need them more between the periods of 1580 to 1603 because she's changing a lot of law. She needs more money as well for fighting Catholics and Spain. So Elizabeth rules predominantly through royal proclamation. So this is the fact that she has the force of the law, but she needs Parliament for new laws and new taxations, etc. So how does she keep them in control? So she can dismiss them as she chooses. So if you displease Elizabeth, she will dismiss you from that role. MPs are selected, not elected, remember, so therefore she's got the control of who is in her Parliament. And Privy Council organise the daily business of Parliament, which means there's a limited chance for discussion against Elizabeth's wishes. They do criticise her from time to time. One of them is the purveyances, so the Queen's right to buy cheap supplies, and the monopolies. So this is where she'd give exclusive rights to certain MPs to make and sell products. This is repeatedly criticised, and she generally ignores them until 1601, where she makes a golden speech promising to cancel some of them. We will talk about the issue of religion and marriage later on as well. So she's the Queen at the top. She needs more people to help her control all over the country. So she's very reliant on her local government. Now, lots of what we're going to talk about are going to be familiar from the Crime and Punishment module, and we do study the early modern period, so that knowledge can be used here as well. So there are Lord Lieutenants who control the military in local areas. They report back to Elizabeth directly. They report on things like the behaviour of the JPs. They inform parish constables of important issues, and they are generally wealthy noblemen. We've then got our sheriffs. The sheriffs deal with legal affairs. They appoint juries, they collect taxes, take people to court. They're wealthy noblemen and gentlemen. We've got our justices of peace. There's about 40 per county, sometimes more, sometimes a bit less, and they maintain the local law, and they will run the quarter sessions, which are growing importance during this period. They also oversee the poor law, and they are educated and wealthy gentlemen. We've got the parish constables, so they will do things like police taverns, they will do the night watches, they look out for vagrants, and they are unpaid positions held by tradesmen or farmers. And then we've got the overseer of the poor, who distributed the money to the poor and decided how that's going to be used. There's no police force in the Elizabethan period, which means it's important to help the keep control. And she does this by using these different methods of law enforcement. All of these positions are unpaid, but many of them come with positions of power, and therefore people are going to happily do it to boost their own status. Okay, what opposition does Elizabeth has? So freedom of speech causes problems from time to time. So MPs should, in theory, be able to speak about any matter they wish to. However, Elizabeth actually bans them from speaking about religion, marriage and foreign affairs. And tied into marriage is the issue of succession. So who is going to take over once she dies? She has a royal veto. So this means she can stop laws being passed which she doesn't like. Puritans in particular really pushed for the idea of freedom of speech. So 2 Puritans were hanged in 1583 for suggesting this. 2 examples then of Puritans specifically speaking up against Elizabeth. We've got John Stubbs. His hand is cut off for writing a Puritan pamphlet and criticising Elizabeth's proposed marriage to the French Catholic, the Duke of Anjou. And in 1593, Peter Wentworth imprisoned in the Tower for urging Elizabeth to name a Protestant successor. Tying into that then, Puritans generally want Elizabeth to marry a Protestant prince. They're very worried and anxious that she might marry a king from another country who is Catholic. They want her to change how the church is organised, and they want to be able to select their own bishops. However, because Elizabeth is Protestant, they do not wish to remove her as queen, because the alternative would be Mary, Queen of Scots, who is in fact Catholic. We'll talk more about Mary when we do Catholics. There is a rebellion against Elizabeth, led by the Earl of Essex. He was a favourite, but defied the Queen in 1589 by joining Drake's failed attack on Lisbon and marrying without permission. Essex, annoyed that he was not the Secretary of State after Cecil's death, in fact it was given to his son, Robert Cecil, Elizabeth sent Essex to Ireland in 1599 to defeat a Catholic rebellion. Instead, he decides to make a truce. Elizabeth bans him from the court in 1600 and take away his monopolies. You might remember from in lesson that there's also the issue do in the Privy Council, where he actually goes to draw his sword on Elizabeth and she actually slaps him to provoke him to do that. Essex leads a rebellion in 1601. He's labelled a traitor though, so the supporters actually abandon him very quickly. He's arrested and executed, so this is actually really significant because it shows the power of Elizabeth's government, particularly men like Walsingham. As soon as he is named a traitor, he loses support and then he's effectively crushed and stopped. And this is right at the end of the reign, so we can see that even at the end, Elizabeth is effectively able to control her country. So lastly, let's look at how she maintains control, and there's two main methods that she does that. So one of them is through the idea of censorship. So if you're censoring something, you are removing it and you're controlling things that you don't want people to see. So things like plays, Elizabeth would actually get to see them in advance and she could remove anything that she didn't like. There's only 60 printing presses in England, which means the Privy Council can actually prevent publications quite easily. Images for portraits are very heavily controlled, so any new templates that the artists wish to use, they had to show a copy to Elizabeth. She's often portrayed as being much younger than she really is, particularly at the end of her reign. That's important to maintain that she's powerful, youthful and young. And the Privy Council would burn unacceptable portraits as well. And then the other way that she kept control was through propaganda. Quite easy to remember some of these because they all begin with a P. So we've got our progresses where she's able to be seen throughout the country. Plays, so this is going to reinforce key issues like importance of monarchy and hierarchy. So publications, so actually things that are published to flatter Elizabeth. Portraits, we've studied these in lessons, so we've looked at how she's given the illusion of being powerful, young and strong. Think about the Armada portrait, for example, or the Rainbow one. So on pennies is Elizabeth's image would be shown, so this would be how most people saw Elizabeth, so it's important that there is an image that she wants to portray on there. Prayers, so they would include a prayer for the Queen's memory, which reinforces her position as God's divinely appointed ruler, and then preaching as well. So preachers have to get a government licence, which means the Queen selected church leaders who would actually spread message of loyalty, so they're not having people openly speaking against Elizabeth. Okay, so this kind of concludes Elizabeth and her government, so please make sure that you are revisiting these areas if there's anything you're unsure on. You can also refer to the RAG rated sheets that we've got and also the scans of the revision guide.